study that was commissioned by the then Institutes of Medicine, now National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine. Congress commissioned them to do a study to actually look at whether the advancements in science and medicine were actually helping Black and brown people, were actually helping minorities. Clearly and overwhelmingly, it was not. And this landmark sort of study really elevated the fact that racism must be the culprit here, that if you control for all these other confounders and access and insurance and all of that, that still we come to find out that there are still differences in health outcomes. And that is truly due to racism. We know that last year, around almost a year ago, a few months from being a year ago, about 10 months ago, a Black doctor filmed from her deathbed, Dr. Susan Moore, that she felt like she was receiving differential treatment based on race, that her doctor was racist, that he made her feel like a drug addict and did not accurately assess and address her pain. He downplayed her complaints of pain, and she filmed this from her deathbed. Unfortunately, she would succumb to and pass away from COVID, but she was a physician herself, which is the scariest and most horrifying thing. That racial bias we see in pain assessment, as we see with Dr. Susan Moore, and treatment outcomes. There's still the false belief by physicians, by medical students, by attendees even, that there are biological differences between Blacks and whites that make Black people have thicker skin and allegedly not be able to feel pain as much. This all harkens back to what we just talked about in the last slide, eugenics, and the continued attempt and fallacy to classify Black and brown people as being genetically different and somehow not able to feel the same emotions that white people can feel. Not too long ago, there was a headline actually earlier this year about the FDA warning about pulse oximeters being less accurate for people with darker skin, that even our advances in technology and our advances in the intersection of health and tech are still very much sort of saturated with the poison of racism. And that even in our attempts to innovate, we are still baking in racism, and we're still baking in things that will continue to cause health inequities. And most recently, actually, 2 days ago, racism was declared as a public health crisis in New York City. It is among 49 other cities and 2 other states who have declared racism as a public health issue. So we know that racism is an issue past and present. We know that we're now on this precipice of, I call sort of like the health equity revolution, if you will, or evolution. Everybody is talking about health equity because we're all experiencing a global pandemic. And we are all navigating this in real time. We have seen how inequities in population health and public health have played out in real time. Everybody and their mother, it feels like, is talking about health equity. So what is health equity? For those who may know or may not know or think that they know, health equity is when all people have the opportunity to attain their highest potential for health and wellness. Let me caution you that equality is not the same thing as equity. Though they are very similar words, they have very different meanings. Equality is giving everyone the same thing, but equity is really tailoring our resources and making sure that we are giving the resources in the way and the amount that a community or individual may need. So I think that public health and population health and healthcare, we have gone about health equity, in my opinion, in a very constrained and very colonized way. I think that there are some ways that we should consider retooling and recalibrating our approach to health equity. So I came up with what I'm calling the 12 essentials for health equity. This is kind of a pressure test here. I'm still thinking about it a little bit, but what I want to draw your attention to is this graphic that I kind of pulled together. First and foremost, what's happening right now that I think is missing in all of our social determinants of health and health equity work is that it is not accurately and fully centered in anti-racism and decolonization. So what I'm kind of putting forward and suggesting, proposing, that we first center anti-racism and decolonization in everything that we do. That the next step around us should be truth and reconciliation and reparations. That we have to first recognize the ways in which we healthcare, public health, as a society have caused more harm than good, and make amends for that. Then when I think about the most important sort of determinants that have an impact on health outcomes, I put those into kind of 5 big buckets. This isn't all inclusive, but when I think about what's having the most impact on communities right now, meaningful work and livable wages, affordable, stable housing, reliable, affordable transportation, equitable educational opportunities, and tech equity. We've had so much happen with the use of telehealth and so many other technological advances, sort of without recognizing the ways that tech and innovation have the ability to further perpetuate inequities if we don't recognize and address the root causes of like the lack of access and the lack of ability to actually take advantage of innovation. And then the outer ring, I think, are kind of the community conditions or the larger conditions that need to be met in order to actually be able to achieve health equity. So reliable sources of truth, which we see is a really big issue right now of misinformation and miseducation, social support, civic engagement and belonging, and community cohesion. Overall, I think centering anti-racism in all people, policies, and practices is important. This must be rooted in critical race theory. Let me pause and say, if you are doing health equity work and it is not rooted in anti-racism, it is not rooted in even talking about race, then you are not doing health equity work, because it is required that we actually talk about power, we talk about systems of oppression, and the ways that that contributes to health outcomes. Truth and reconciliation that powers reparations must also be an additional step, focusing on the root causes of health inequities and the most crucial social determinants of health, and then including access and understanding of technology as essential for health equity. What you can do, I want to leave you with a few thoughts on what you can actually do in your work as you're actively engaging in it right now. Encouraging you to center anti-racism in everything you do. Remember that just being against racism is not the same as being actively anti-racist. And I would encourage those of you representing lots of different organizations to actively seek opportunities to embed anti-racism. Elevate lived experience and community voice from the start. Oftentimes, I think inclusion of community voice is an afterthought. It comes at the point of thinking about, well, how do we socialize this idea or this intervention or this program or opportunity, when in fact, we should be elevating and including community voice and lived experience from the start. And then I want to encourage you to move at the pace of trust. Right now, it feels like we're trying to move at the speed of light. I think we all recognize that we have windows of time in which massive change can occur, and we're in a current window, a portal, if you will, right now. But I also think that it is a tool of white supremacy for us to think that time will not stand still for us, that we have to do everything and move quickly and just cover as much ground as possible at the expense of actually doing meaningful work, at the expense of actually building meaningful relationships, and at the expense of actually building trust. I want to encourage you to move at the pace of trust and take the time to build relationships with the communities, with the individuals you seek to serve. An example of how we put equity into action, the Equitist has worked with the Commonwealth of Virginia throughout the COVID-19 crisis. And very early on, before kind of the whole nation was really understanding what health equity was in real time, I was very instrumental and had the opportunity to work with our Department of Emergency Management in creating an equity pilot program where we brought 40,000 pieces of COVID-19 PPE and hand sanitizers, et cetera, to low-income Richmond residents. This was at the time when all these things were in shortage, and challenging the emergency management department, challenging our public health department to prioritize resource distribution through the lens of equity was hard, right? But it was so meaningful. We took the time to engage the fire departments. We actually did real-time training on racism, on health equity, on the social determinants of health. We engaged our fire department to go door to door in communities that we outlined as being the most vulnerable to COVID-19 outbreaks. And we actually literally went door to door, leaving masks and hand sanitizers for the people who needed it the most. And so, I want to leave you with a couple of final thoughts and give you a chance to ask some questions. We can have a little bit of discussion. Oftentimes when we're hearing about health inequities, there is a tendency to put this into the context of race being a risk factor or race being a problem here. It is racism, and let me remind you, it is the system of racism and not simply being of a particular race that is the problem, right? So it's racism, not race. Try to remind yourself of that. Try to hold others accountable for sharing that, and think hard about the context in which we talk about inequities, recognizing that we have to put the pressure on the systems. It is racism, not race, that is the issue here. And because of that, if we're ever going to get to health equity, anti-racism absolutely must be our foundation. And with that, thank you. And I'm happy to perhaps take some questions. As soon as I figure out how to stop sharing my screen. Okay.
So everyone, if you drop your question.
We might have lost Elaine for a second, but yeah, if you want to drop your questions into the chat, and I'm going to try to catch up on some of your comments. I'm sorry I couldn't see them in real time. I see. Yeah, thank you for the comments here. Oh, thank you for the comments about the framework too. Appreciate that. And sorry that this isn't longer. I'll take that into account. I see. Thank you so much for this clear truth telling. Is your framework publicly available? Thanks, Jill, for that question. It is not publicly available yet, mostly because I'm kind of thinking a little bit harder about it. But it is something. If you, I would love to hear more thoughts on if you think it is comprehensive. I'm actually want to sit with it a little bit while longer, but I do plan to make it more publicly available. So thanks for asking the question. Yeah. Elizabeth, I see your question. What clients have you found the most powerful in terms of having impact? A really great question, Elizabeth. I'll say we are just getting started. So I started the company kind of at the beginning of COVID and have had the opportunity already to work with a number of different clients. One that I really found to be very impactful. I think government is always one of strong impact. Government's really challenging. I'm a former state health official. I was the director of health equity for the Commonwealth of Virginia. So I know the challenges of state and government systems, but I think government is always very powerful because there is just such a huge remit over, that government has power over. So I think the Department of Emergency Management actually has been very powerful, in my opinion. We don't often think about how many emergencies or what is qualified as an emergency that happens, everything from, natural disasters to unfortunate.
Okay, everyone, since we are approaching the end of the session, if you want to actually connect with Lauren through the engagement features and ask her any remaining questions you might have, and I'm sure she'll love to get back to you on all of that. So if you go to the panel on the right side of your screen, there's a little icon at the top that says Changemakers. You can search for Lauren there and send her a direct chat. So feel free to do that if you have any lingering questions. Otherwise, if you want to continue the discussion in the chat, you're welcome to do so. It looks like we have about 3 more minutes left on this clock. Our apologies for the technical difficulties, but we hope you still got a lot out of this session, and thanks for tuning in.